Our coverage of Rugby Union World Cup 2023 continues tomorrow night with the much-anticipated match between the host nation France and Italy. The build-up gets underway Friday night from 7:30. But now on STV Scotland Tonight, a by-election special.
The polls have closed and the votes are being counted in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. Can the SNP defy the odds and see off a strong Labour challenge? Or will Sir Keir Starmer's party win big and rebuild its strength in Scotland? Stay tuned for live coverage and analysis. Good evening. It's now more than an hour and a half since polls closed in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. The result could serve as a strong indication of the prevailing public mood ahead of next year's UK general election. Can the SNP somehow manage to hold on to a Westminster seat they won with a 5,000 majority in 2019? For Labour, a failure to win back this former heartland would be seen as a disaster. This will all be revealed in the next hour or two, along with the fate of the other parties. To react to the unfolding story, we have with us the expert political analysis of Bernard Ponsonby and a panel of senior politicians. And we'll be hearing lots from the election count too. Let's cross live to STV's political correspondent Ewan Petrie, who's at South Lanarkshire Council headquarters in Hamilton. Ewan, what's the latest?
Evening, Colin. Well, the last of the ballot boxes have arrived here, so this count is well underway now. It began just after 10 o'clock with the counting of the postal votes, then the first of the ballot boxes started arriving around about 20 past 10. So we're well into this count now, and some of the candidates have been arriving here. We've seen the Liberal Democrats candidate, the Conservatives candidate, no sign yet of Labour or the SNP. 14 candidates, though, standing in this election. But all the indications at the moment are that this seat will be returning to Labour.
And what are the parties saying there? I mean, the candidates from the main parties don't usually return up until later on anyway, do they?
No, they don't. No, we won't be expecting them until much closer to the declaration. But, you know, speaking to some of the Labour team here, it was quite strange at the beginning of the evening. They were playing it quite canny to begin with, saying that they'd been receiving a warm reception on the doorstep. But now I think they are fully and openly admitting that they are extremely confident they are going to win this seat back. They feel that potentially they could be looking at a swing of 7 or 8% to them in this seat, potentially even higher. And they say, look, that would bring in a lot of seats, SNP seats, into play at next year's general election. The SNP, for their part, they've been using the word challenging a lot during this campaign, and I've been hearing it a lot again here tonight. They're saying, look, what's happening here is that a lot of Conservative voters and Liberal Democrat voters have moved their vote to Labour temporarily. They think this is a temporary switch to Labour, and this won't be replicated in a general election next year. The Tories and the Lib Dems, for their part, well, they admit their vote is being squeezed here. I've heard suggestions here tonight that both these parties could even lose their deposit.
And what time are you expecting the declaration there in Hamilton?
Well, lots of speculation about a declaration. I've heard anything from between 12 o'clock right through to 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm remaining optimistic at this stage. I'm thinking between 12:30 and 1 o'clock, around about that time. Crucial to that will be the turnout. The suggestion at the moment is that the turnout, we're looking at somewhere in the mid-30s to late 30s percentage-wise. That would put us in line with the Airdrie Shotts by-election. A low turnout would, of course, mean that the declaration may come earlier than we expect.
Well, we'll come back to you and find out what's going on. Thanks for just now, Ewan. But this is going to be a busy night with the prospect of some real political drama. We've been out on the streets of Rutherglen finding out what's driving people's votes today. And Bernard will be looking back at some of the most memorable by-elections in Scottish political history. But as we know, tonight's candidates are fighting for a seat last contested at the 2019 Westminster election. Let's take a look at that result. There you had Margaret Ferrier top of that list with a 7.2% swing from Labour at that point. Bernard, what did you make of that result and what are we looking for tonight?
Well, of course, this is Labour's number 4 target constituency in Scotland. When Keir Starmer was in Rutherglen last week, he was making the point. If there's to be a UK Labour government, he wants a UK Labour government which is made not only in England and Wales, but in Scotland as well. Only one Scottish Labour MP at the moment. This constituency went SNP in 2015, it went to Labour in 2017, back to the SNP in 2019. The swing that Labour need tonight in order to win this seat is just under 5% of the vote. Ewan saying there from the count, Labour people talking about a swing of 7 or 8%. But if you look at the figures from the last time around, look at the vote for the Conservatives in this constituency. It's 15% of the vote, over 8,000 votes. Now, what we would expect in a by-election dynamic is tactical voting on the Unionist side of the constitutional divide, and we would expect a significant squeeze in the Conservative vote tonight. But simply relying on a squeeze of the Conservative vote does not take Labour over the line. They have to start taking votes from the SNP. Why are they confident that they can take votes from the SNP? Well, at the 2019 general election, the Nationalists had 45% of the vote. Labour's percentage share in Scotland below 19%. But the last 20-odd opinion polls suggest that the SNP are down, Labour are up. So a mixture of tactical voting tonight plus the dynamic of a higher Labour vote with a lower SNP vote should take Labour over the line. The only question, how big is the swing, how big is the majority, and how will it translate onto the other seats in Scotland at the general election
Well, that's the
next year?
drama we're looking forward to when we get the result from you in a wee while. Let's now hear from our studio guest, though. We have with us Kirsten Oswald, who is the SNP MP for East Renfrewshire, Ian Murray, who's the shadow Scottish Secretary, and currently, at least, Scotland's only Labour MP, and MSP Megan Gallagher, who's the Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives. Kirsten, what are you expecting to come out of this? This is your chance for a bit of expectation management. So what are your expectations tonight?
Well, I mean, let's see. We've got a wee while to go, not too long, I suspect, given what we've heard, to see what the result will be. But, you know, it's obviously a challenging set of circumstances that we're facing in this by-election. So, you know, I think that our activists have done a fantastic job all over the constituency over recent weeks and months, and you know, nobody could have done more. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a challenging situation, and in a marginal seat already. Bernard's already told us that it is the 4th target seat, and talked about the fact that this seat has swung back and forward between SNP and Labour since 2010.
So you saying it's Labour's turn this time?
Well, let's see what's happened. Let's see
this is a fairly early concession of defeat, if that's what you're doing.
I'm certainly not conceding anything. I'm always a glass half full kind of person, so my glass will remain there. But I think that it is a challenging situation. Let's see where we get to. But we certainly worked very hard and fought very hard.
Ian Murray, you're just looking for a pal at Westminster, aren't you?
Well, it's an interesting first question you've asked there, Colin, because if the first question you asked me, if I remember, when I first became Shadow Secretary of State in 2020 was, can the Scottish Labour Party survive? And look at us now, 3 years later, under the leadership of Anas Sarwar and Keir Starmer, and we're talking about not whether or not Labour can win this by-election, but by how much can we win, to give us an indication of how the next general election might go.
What's your expectation management for tonight then?
Well,
I mean, we're hearing from the count from you in there that your own party activists are saying between 7 and 8% swing.
Well, I mean, let's see, because one of the things we've been fighting against today is monsoon rain and turnout. That might depress turnout.
So are you playing this down
Well,
then?
smaller turnouts just mean that swings can be much less. So let's be seeing what we're going to look at a wee bit later on. But
so hang on,
thing
Kirsten's
here,
expectation management is that they're probably not going to win it. Your expectation management is you might not win it that well. Well, Megan Gallagher, what's your expectation management tonight? Are you going to save your deposit?
Well, we've always known that this was going to be a two-horse race, and we knew that our vote was going to be squeezed. This has always been the expectation that we've had coming into this election, but we wanted to give the Scottish Conservative voters a good candidate to vote for. And I'm so proud of Thomas Kerr, because he's been the standout candidate in this election. You know, he's ran a fantastic local campaign.
So why are we talking about you losing your deposit then, potentially?
Because our vote, I think, has been squeezed at this election, and that's something
Do you think you will?
that we have.
Do you think you will hold your deposit?
Well, we'll need to wait and see.
5% is what you need to do that.
We
Do you
will
think you're going to get there?
See, but I think, you know, our vote will be squeezed tonight, but we'll just need to wait and see by what margin.
And do you think it'll be squeezed by people turning to Labour?
It could well be. I mean, I think there might be, you know, an element of tactical voting there, but, you know, it will be squeezed. I don't think it'll be reflection right enough on seats across Scotland whenever the next general election is. That's months, if not a year away from now, so I don't think it'll be reflection on that.
Well, we'll come back to you all in just a few minutes, but this by-election has, of course, put the voters of Rutherglen and Hamilton West in the national spotlight. STV's reporter Caroline Lewis braved the rain today to get a feel for the mood in the constituency on polling day.
Well, the weather may not be brilliant, but that hasn't stopped people coming out to have their say. The polls have been open since 7 a.m, so I'm here in Rutherglen to see who people are backing in the by-election.
Labour.
And why was that?
Because my wife is a Labour woman and I do what my wife tells me. Labour's going to win anyway. You know, if you go into the bookies, I like a bet. And I went into the bookies and asked the price in the bookies. And they said that Labour were 12 to 1 on to win it. So.
Do you mind me asking who you voted for?
SNP.
SNP? And
Yes.
have you always voted SNP?
Yes, since I've been able to vote.
And why do you vote for SNP?
Because I think we need independence, simple as that.
Are you going to be voting today?
No.
Why not?
I wouldn't encourage either, to be quite honest with you. That's just, no, waste of time.
First year in my life I've not voted because I don't trust any of them and they never do anything they say they're going to do.
Well, I'll be voting Labour anyway.
Do you always vote Labour?
Well, I wouldn't vote SNP. We've got a government that can't tell you the difference between a man and a woman.
I don't know yet.
You don't know yet. What do you think will sway your decision?
Things to benefit my kid. I've got a wee boy at 9.
Have you voted today?
No.
Are you going to be voting?
Probably not.
And why not?
Because I don't have anything worth voting for. Nothing local. That's why. Really, any of the candidates are doing anything locally.
Have you voted today?
Yes.
And who did you vote for?
Labour?
And do you always vote Labour?
Nope.
So this is the first time?
Yes.
What made you change your mind?
Well, I wasn't voting for SNP because they're useless.
There you go, the voters have spoken. We'll not say what comes next in that quote. Bernard, what did you make of the expectation management and then the expectation of the voters?
Well, of course, this is what politicians always say at this stage in an election programme. Now, in terms of the SNP downplaying their chances, I mean, it is fair to say they have been in power for 17 years, and normally when the voters get weary with a party, it is not unexpected that a by-election will be lost. So you can understand why they're putting that caveat on it. I can also understand why Ian is coy about talking about swings at this stage, but swings are important, you know, because if Labour had to get a 5% swing uniformly across Scotland at a general election, they would only be picking up 4 seats. But if the swing goes to 10% or more, then in a general election situation, based upon the existing boundaries, and we'll come back to this bit later on in the programme, but based upon the existing boundaries, a whole series of SNP seats start to come into play. And of course, if Labour can take 15, 20 seats in Scotland, that makes the job in the UK that much easier in terms of Keir Starmer looking ahead to a majority Labour government. I think that if the Conservatives are squeezed in this by-election today, we shouldn't really be all that surprised. It is normally the dynamic in a by-election that if you support a candidate who normally comes third or fourth and your party cannot win, that you will transfer tactically. The question for the Conservatives is that having started in 15% of the vote, will it go as low as 6, 5? If it goes below 5, of course, it's a lost deposit. But what should people be looking out for when the declaration comes? They should be looking at not just about whether or not it's a Labour victory, but how good a Labour victory is and what that means in terms of a general election scenario.
Before I go to the panel, losing your deposit, 5%, what does that mean, really? I mean, it means losing your 500 quid deposit, doesn't it? It's not that big a deal, really, but it's a bit embarrassing.
It's not a big deal, but it's I think, important in reputational terms. I mean, right the way across West Central Scotland at the general election, the Liberal Democrats, for example, lost most of their deposits in most of the seats. The Conservatives used to do very, very badly in Central Belt seats, 15% in Rutherglen, in one of the neighbouring constituencies in terms of the percentage share of the vote in 2019. They were up at 18 and 19%. The Conservative share of the vote in 2019 was 25% in Scotland. It was very respectable. They are polling nothing like that. So if they lose their deposit tonight, we shouldn't be surprised. They might just hold on to it.
Kirsten Oswald, we saw the voters or some of them, not all of them, some of them. There's a bit of apathy there. There's a bit of antipathy towards your party as well, though.
I'm not sure that the antipathy is only towards the SNP. I detected a little bit of fed-upness amongst those voters in general. I suspect the weather probably didn't help with that either. It has been utterly miserable. I feel like I've only just dried out. But, you know, a party who is a party of government, as we are in Scotland, in by-elections, you know, will potentially struggle. So that's one of the challenging things that we've been trying to push against with Katie Loudon, our candidate, who's an excellent candidate and would be an outstanding MP. I would like to go back to something that Bernard said, though, you know, talking about how you know, polling and figures are working. If we look at the most recent polls, then the SNP are actually in the lead in both Westminster and Holyrood voting intentions. So this is a very specific contest, and you know, let's see what all the details are that unfold.
That was the most recent opinion poll. That was the one most recent opinion poll where you were substantially ahead, about 10 points.
But I actually don't think we can necessarily do a
half a dozen in the run-up to that when you were even.
The key thing here, though, is the 2019 base in terms of the general election. The SNP were at 45%. Labour were below 19%. Now, what the polls, if you look at the trend in the polls, demonstrate is that the SNP, compared to 2019, and remember, the votes in this constituency that we're talking about are 2019 votes, it suggests that the SNP vote is down and the Labour vote is up. It suggests that there is movement between these two parties. And if the polls are borne out tonight, Labour will win.
Ian Murray, you can't be surprised by that evening out of the polls, given the tough year that Kirsten's party's had.
Well, look, we were starting on 18.6% was the general election in 2019, but in actual fact, before that, we were polling at 14% in the polls. We managed to double that to the high 20s after Anas Sarwar became leader, and of course we've increased that ever since. But there's two big things that we're not talking about tonight that is blowing up some of these statistics. And of course, Bernard's right to talk about the third party being squeezed. We're also right to talk about tactical voting. But the key thing from this by-election will be that where's the SNP vote gone? And I've been on the doorsteps for weeks and weeks and weeks and getting SNP supporters who voted for SNP for a long time coming back to Labour. In fact, I had a SNP member this morning who, when I knocked on his door and he pulled out his wallet and flashed his SNP membership card at me, I thought, well, I'll just put you down as against or whatever on our sheets. But he was telling me he said, his exact words were, I voted for your guy this morning. So one of the key messages isn't going to be about who's being squeezed or statistics or polls, but what has actually happened to the SNP vote, and that will be key in terms of what happens at the general election. And the second thing, if I just may, Colin, the other thing is, yeah, of course, the third and fourth parties will get squeezed because it always happens in by-elections. But people on the doorstep are utterly sick of this Conservative UK government. They've crashed the economy. They're costing residents in that constituency hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month because of decisions that they've made, and they're utterly fed up with that too. So the by-election gives them an opportunity to also transfer the vote on the basis that they want something else to do and they want to send a message that what they're getting from the UK government is not what they expect.
I'll come to you in a minute, Megan, but Kirsten Oswald, just answer what Ian's saying there about... Oh, hang on. We've got an announcement from the count. Let's go back to you.
I advise you that the verification total and percentage turnout for the Rutherglen and Hamilton West constituency is as follows. Total electorate, 82,104. Total number of votes cast, 30,531. Percentage turnout, 37.19%. I'll repeat that. Total electorate, 82,104. Total number of votes cast, 30531. Percentage turnout, 37.19%. Copies of the verification sheets are now available from the information officer.
Well, that's the turnout, 37% turnout. Bernard, what do you make of that? That's better than some people had been predicting, but it's still on the low side, isn't it?
It's on the low side. I mean, if we look at the turnout in this constituency, 69.6% in 2015, 63.5% in 2017, 66.5% in 2019. Now, by-election turnouts are never as high as the general election. I think that's primarily down to the really rotten day, which has depressed turnouts. It is higher than the 34% in Airdrie and Shotts in 2021, but it's lower than 45% in Inverclyde 2011, below the 42% in that election in Glasgow East in 2008 that John Mason won, below the 48.7% in Dunfermline and West Fife, won by Willie Rennie in 2005, and also below the 38.6% in Livingston in 2005.
Also, I think it's what you took in the sweep, 37%, didn't you? In the office sweep on this.
I had 42.
Did you have 42? Someone had. I had 40. So I've slightly overestimated this as well. Megan, what did you make of that turnout?
Well, I think it's to be anticipated with a by-election. You know, by-elections tend to be lower, as been discussed up until this point. So I'm not shocked at all.
No, it was the producer that got the 37% you just told me.
What does he win?
Yeah, he doesn't win very much. I think it's a bag of sweets.
I think actually, I mean, we were projecting that turnout would probably be in the low 40s. In fact, if you'd asked me yesterday what we were thinking about, I think the bag of sweets would have gone to Bernard. We're looking at low 40s, but it has been utterly miserable today. And you can't deny that people might just look outside their window and go, we're not going out. In fact, I spoke to a number of people who said, we'll go out when the rain stops. It never did. And therefore, maybe they just stayed at home.
Kirsten, is a low turnout bad for you? Does it show that you've not managed to get your vote out or anything like that? Does it show that for any of the parties?
I mean, I guess a low turnout across the board is going to be something that all parties would wish not to see. Obviously, in a by-election, you are likely to see fewer people coming out to vote. It has been, I know everybody's said this, but I think it's difficult to convey how absolutely rotten the weather has been today, and I think it has been one of these days when people are more reluctant to come out. But I mean, that is a low figure. You know, so what kind of endorsement that will be ultimately, you know, I think that's probably an issue that we could consider as well. I suppose I'm not entirely surprised, though, that it is at that level, given the horrible day that
and the weather
was.
has been bad, but if what we were finding, have SNP voters stayed at home? Right. Have they decided that this could be their protest wasn't to switch their vote, but stay at home?
We'll find out when we get the result, and we're just going back to the count just now to you and Petrie.
Yeah, lots of murmuring, lots of chats, lots of huddles, just reacting to the declaration of the turnout here. And the SNP candidate, Katie Loudon, has just turned up. She is being swamped by journalists and campaigners right now. But I'm joined by the co-leader of the Scottish Greens here on the platform. Thank you for joining us this evening, Patrick Harvey. Just first of all, your reaction to that turnout figure.
Well, it's always depressing when you get a low turnout, whatever the circumstances, whichever side of the debate you're on. We should be aiming to engage people and give people a reason to turn out. I think a lot of people have felt pretty scunnered by the long, slow run-up to this by-election. It's felt like a really drawn-out campaign, and that hasn't inspired people. There's obviously quite a lot of SNP voters who've chosen to stay at home, and I think a lot of Labour voters, whether they've turned out to vote Labour or not, I think they've been a little bit confused about what Labour actually stand for, the differences between Keir Starmer's position, the candidate's position, and some of the Scottish Labour positions. That's been a bit bewildering for some people. But look, when barely more than a third of the electorate turn out to vote, that's bad for democracy, it's bad for all of us. And I would hope that, you know, if the UK general election isn't too far away, I hope we can make it a much more engaging one with really the opportunity for decisive change, because that's what the country needs. I don't think we're getting that kind of offer from a sort of centrist version of the Labour Party. And I hope that the next UK election actually gives us a chance not just to kick out a toxic Tory government, but to get a change of direction for the country.
And how do you see it going tonight then?
Oh, I don't think anyone in the room here is in much doubt that it will be a Labour win, probably a fairly strong one. You know, I think probably are a lot of SNP voters who may have chosen not to turn out. I've certainly spoken to voters on the doorstep who've just been you know, a bit sick of it all, a bit sick of the long drawn-out run-up. Certainly, very, very disillusioned with the reasons why this by-election had to take place, with Margaret Ferrier's disgrace, and you know, the fact that she hung on for so long, really, you know, began this whole by-election with a kind of a bad smell around it, and a sense that people were feeling that disillusionment with politics was justified because of her behaviour.
And what about your own party? How do you think you'll do tonight? Will you keep your deposit?
Well, it's always a little difficult to tell with a Westminster election, and in particular a by-election. It's often easy to present it as a two-horse race. Lots of voters feel that they have to vote for one of the two front runners. We've never stood here in a constituency level before. Obviously, we've stood at a regional level. And so it's been, for us, about laying the groundwork, having good conversations with voters, laying the groundwork for what could be additional regional seats or council seats in the future. But also, a lot of the conversations we've had have shown how angry and worried people are by the UK government ripping up environmental policies left, right and centre. You know, people here, you know, in many parts of the constituency, you can see the Kilmarnock wind turbine on the horizon. It's a big dominant feature on the horizon. People see that there's renewable electricity being generated, but they're not getting the benefit of that in their bills because of the way the UK badly regulates the energy market.
OK, listen, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Patrick Harvey. And with that, from the Count, it's back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Ewan. Bernard, Patrick Harvey, they are talking about the circumstances of this by-election. It's the first time we've ever had a recall by-election in Scotland. It's quite significant. But he's talking about the bad smell. I mean, obviously he's talking about the circumstances that forced Margaret Ferrier to be ousted by her own constituents.
Yeah, it's very difficult to assess and quantify just what that means in terms of actual votes. I think it's fairly true to say that if the Margaret Ferrier's circumstances was going to affect any party's vote, it was most likely to affect the SNP vote. But the honest answer is, you know, 30,000 people have cast their vote in this by-election. It's impossible to determine just how many might have switched on the basis of the circumstances of the election. But given how low the turnout is, I mean, one of the factors, and again, it's very difficult to quantify, is which political party was most successful in getting their vote out. If you lose a by-election and you have a very low turnout, normally the first thing that a representative on a panel will say is that, well, our voters have stayed at home, the turnout is very low. When we get to a general election situation, when the turnout will be north of 60%, our voters will come back out and vote, and they'll probably say we've simply loaned the constituency. But one of the points that I would make, having covered these elections for over 30 years, what was noticeable in the constituency, and I don't know if you would agree with this, in terms of boots on the ground, I saw more Labour activists in this by-election than for many a year, because in previous by-elections, I think the Labour campaign has been comfortably outmuscled by the SNP.
Absolutely. Not this time around. Absolutely. I've seen the same thing. But I think what we need tonight is a Bernard bingo card, so that when you predict what they're going to say, people can mark it off when they then say it in half an hour's time or whatever. But is that something that you've noticed during the campaign, that you have? Because for years now, the point Bernard makes is, I've seen Labour struggling to get the activists out. By-elections, general elections, every election in Scotland. This time you seem to have had the boots on the ground that you've struggled with for years now.
Yeah, and Labour Party members have got their mojo back. It's been a tough decade, really tough decade on the doorsteps, down to very much core activists. But this by-election has given people the opportunity to come out campaigning for Labour again. They're enjoying the message on the doorsteps. Of course, you want to enjoy a victory, and the comparison couldn't be starker, that we had over 1,200 individual volunteers coming out to help us up until today, and there was about 500 we had out today, and the SNP were using 0 hours contract workers to deliver the leaflets. That couldn't be starker in terms of a comparison between activists and what needs to be done to get people out.
Hundreds of people on the ground, which has been great. And you know,
you were using 0 hours contract workers to deliver your leaflets at the start of the campaign.
And you will have had people delivering your leaflets
all
as well.
Volunteers.
This is,
all volunteers.
This is the thing.
All volunteers.
But in terms of the boots on the ground, we have had an absolute army of SNP activists out on the ground, and I'm really grateful for that. And you know, I think I hear Ian saying the same. You know, he's really grateful. But we all, I'm sure, support the huge body of work that people put in. But it's absolutely the case that the SNP has been on the ground here and doing the hard yards.
But you've nevertheless been outgunned by Labour for the first time in a by-election that I can remember for a long time.
Well, we'll see, obviously.
But in terms of the activists out on the ground, I mean, you know, Ian's talking about what, 1,200, 1,300 people out?
Activists were thirsty for change. The constituents are thirsty for change.
I would
and
want
because
to do
we've
the
been out
maths on
talking
that.
to them and doing that, our activists are now thirsty to deliver that change for them.
Did you have trouble getting some of your activists out?
No,
there were
the
reports earlier in the campaign that you had trouble getting some of your MPs out.
No, we've had elected members, but mostly, of course, our party is a grassroots party. So we've had activists out in their numbers, and I've been delighted about that. You know, and today again was the same. Despite the terrible weather, we were out in absolute droves, and I am very grateful to the activists for coming out in this appalling weather, but they have been doing that over weeks. So I don't know what the comparative numbers are, but I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say that we have got a sort of different body of
using an army of zero-hours contract workers against our volunteers. That's the
we're using
numbers.
Volunteers, Ian, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them that have been on the ground.
Apologised for it.
Well,
but you're not suggesting that we've not had these volunteers on the ground,
because we haven't forgotten about her. Megan, what was your activist base like during this campaign, given that you knew throughout your vote was going to be squeezed?
Well, I'm
and
disappointed.
is it tough to motivate them in those circumstances?
I'm actually disappointed in Ian, because what Ian's just said, it's as though Labour only come out when they think they can win. Conservatives come out, come rain, wind or shine, and that was testament during this by-election. You know, Thomas Kerr's run a fantastic campaign. You know, we've had good activist groundwork, and we've covered as much ground as possible. So I think we've actually had a really good campaign. But Ian, I am disappointed. That's really not a good message.
Well, that's not what I said. I said that people had their mojo back, and of course you get your mojo back as well after a 10 years decade of being in the gutter.
So you're denying that they're fair weather campaigners?
No, of course they're not. It's been very difficult on the doorstep. So people have got their confidence.
Has it been difficult on the doorsteps? Has it been difficult for Labour on the doorsteps? I mean, it has been for years now. But has this been an easier by-election for you?
That's the point I'm making. For a decade now, it's been really difficult on the doorsteps for the Labour Party in Scotland. We only have myself as an MP, so we were losing seats everywhere, including by-elections as well. So it was really important to show that our activist base is back. They're desperate and thirsty for change, and they want to deliver that Labour government.
I'll come around you all in a minute, Bernard.
One of the interesting things about this by-election campaign, and all three candidates on the debate that you chaired on Scotland Tonight, Colin, agreed that the cost of living crisis was the #1 issue in the election. And I suspect when the general election comes, that will also be the #1 issue at the election. And I think one of the problems that Labour have had post-2014 is that just about every national election, and indeed sometimes by-elections as well, have been thought through the prism of the constitutional question. Now, it's the responsibility of the SNP to keep independence at the forefront of the agenda and to keep independence relevant. But what was interesting in this by-election is that there wasn't a lot of chat about the Constitution. And we may well be seeing and entering a period where constitutional politics are less relevant than bread and butter issues. And that kind of political terrain, I think, is easier terrain for Labour to navigate rather than the constitutional
I think we'll
question.
come back to the Constitution later on when we're discussing things. But Kirsten Oswald, how big an issue was what Bernard's talking about, the cost of living crisis, but also what we were talking about earlier, the Margaret Ferrier factor? How big an issue were these on the doorsteps for you?
And I think that for the people in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, but much more broadly as well, the cost of living is the thing that looms large, and you know there's no doubt about that, and that we've got a lot to say about that, and you know that's I think a reasonable position to be in, given the challenges that people are facing, and certainly I'll welcome the opportunity to talk about the constitutional question and independence in the context of that, because neither of the big Westminster parties are offering us a positive change, and you know goodness knows people need something positive and a way out of this terribly difficult situation. situation. I think in terms of the Margaret Ferrier question, yes, obviously this is a challenging situation for the SNP. Plainly it was a difficult local issue. Plainly that is one of the contexts in which we've been fighting this by-election. So it would be impossible to deny that that's an issue. And I suppose it's one of the many factors that will feed in when
one
we
of the
see
many
what the
problems you've had over the last year, because let's face it, Scottish politics really massively moved earlier this year when Nicola Sturgeon stepped down, and that seemed to create more of a level playing field. Has that been an issue for you during this campaign, that, all the SNP's problems, the financial problems, the scandals, everything around that, the new leader coming in, how difficult has that been for you to persuade, to motivate your members, your support, your campaigners, let alone the voters? I mean, he's saying Labour have got their mojo back. Yours has surely gone missing a bit.
It's certainly been a challenging period of time, and that's why I've been so heartened by the activists being so willing to come out. It's not been the best of times, but they've been there with us on the doorsteps. I think it obviously has been a period of significant change for us as well. I'm really grateful that Humza Yousaf has led from the front in all of that. I think that's absolutely what we've needed, and he's done a first-class job of all of that. So I do think that we are in a much more positive phase now than we have been, but it's certainly been an interesting period of time to be involved.
Well, let's see if there's corroboration for what you're saying, because Ewan has one of your party members from Westminster with him at the count. Over to you, Ewan.
That's right, I've got David Linden, the SNP MP, with me. Now, David, it's not looking good for your party tonight, is it?
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing is a total collapse in the Conservative Party's vote, which has clearly gone to the Labour Party, to the extent that I would not be surprised if the Conservatives lose their deposit. I think, though, that raises a much wider question about why it is that Labour have moved so far to the right that Conservative Party voters now feel comfortable voting for Sir Keir Starmer's pro-Brexit Labour Party.
Is this just all down to tactical voting, then? Is that what you're saying?
Look, I think the First Minister was clear that this was a by-election with a challenging backdrop for us. There's no doubt about that. Now, we'll see the results when they come. But one of the things that I've detected as we've gone through the campaign has been an element of tactical voting, but also just that collapse in the Conservative vote that has now gone to a Labour Party that seems almost indistinguishable from the Conservative Party in terms of policies, whether that's on Rwanda, whether that's in terms of Brexit, two-child policy and rape clause. You could not get a cigarette paper between Labour and the Conservatives now, and that's perhaps why they're sharing votes tonight.
But how can you be confident that next year these people will come back to you?
Well, I think one of the things that we see is that this is a by-election that has had a challenging backdrop locally. There's no doubt about that. The previous MP, Margaret Ferrier, the circumstances in which she was removed from office, bear in mind the first ever recall petition in Scottish political history. I don't necessarily think that the backdrop that we've seen for this by-election can be so easily transposed to a general election that is probably a year away. There is also some other issues that I think will be fought on the general election campaign. I certainly have no issue whatsoever with us making our case to people in Scotland that Scotland is a nation and nations are best served when they govern themselves. That's not been a factor in this campaign. I rather suspect it'll be a factor in the general election.
Labour were saying earlier on they could potentially be looking at a 7 or 8% swing. They've revised that now. They reckon they're looking at potentially upwards of 10%. Does that make you worry that you could be losing quite a few of your colleagues come next year?
Not necessarily, because I think a general election campaign there'll be other issues at play. Let's not forget, we had a Scottish Labour candidate that disassociated himself from a huge raft of Labour policies, saying he was uncomfortable with their position on Brexit, he was uncomfortable with their position on the two-child policy and rape clause. I think in the heat of a general election campaign, he will not necessarily be able to get away with that. We will also see Sir Keir Starmer come much more to the fore in a general election campaign. Every single bit of literature I saw from the Labour candidate in this election, Sir Keir Starmer was nowhere. So when you consider all of that in the context of the general election, I think it's very difficult to transpose the result that we may see here in Rutherglen tonight to next year's election.
And what are you hearing on a declaration?
I'm hoping that it'll be this side of 1 o'clock in the morning, because I think we all want to get to bed at a reasonable time tonight.
OK, David Linden, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And with that, it's back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Ewan. Now, I'm going to come to you, Ian, because I'm going to go back to something that Patrick Harvey was saying earlier. He was saying that people have been confused about what Labour stand for in this by-election. Now, he's particularly talking, I think, about that two-child benefit cap, because your candidate, your Scottish leader, saying one thing, and then you've got Sir Keir Starmer saying the other thing.
No, we've been pretty clear on that. Our entire campaign's about addressing the cost of living crisis. That's what everyone's been talking to us on the doorstep. And what they have been saying to us is they're completely fed up of feeling as if both governments are letting them down at the moment, and they want some action to do that. So they're very happy to send messages tonight to both the UK and Scottish governments that they're not doing enough to help people through this cost of living crisis. What we've also said pretty clearly is, look, you can keep taking each individual benefit, and I'm sure if we said something on the two-child cap, you'll then come to the bedroom tax, say something on the bedroom tax, you'll then come to something else. We've committed to a fundamental...
All these things that you seem to be U-turning on.
Well, let me finish the sentence. We've come to the conclusion and a policy position of a fundamental reform of universal credit, which includes all of those, sitting alongside our child poverty reduction strategy. Look, Labour governments always reduce poverty, child poverty in particular, which has shot up in the last 13 years of Conservative government and 6 years of SNP government. So we don't take any lessons from anyone on how to reduce child poverty, but a fundamental reform of universal credit, sitting alongside the child poverty strategy is the way you deal with poverty, not by talking about individual benefits.
Well, I'm going to welcome Sandesh Gulhani to the studio just now, who's a substitute for Megan Gallagher, who's nipping off to the count to see what the result is there. You're going to be here for the result. We also heard from Patrick Harvey before talking about how long drawn out this campaign has been. Has it felt like that to you?
Well, it's been a long time since Margaret Ferrier disgraced herself with what she did.
But the campaign hasn't been going quite that long.
Well, there was a lot of talk as soon as it happened, and there was talk of the recall petition. So there's been a lot of discussions around the Rutherglen by-election. So it has been...
Did you get a lot of chat on the doorsteps about Margaret Ferrier?
There was conversations about why we were doing it and what happened, but actually what we really started talking about was what Scotland's real issues are. You know, we're looking at how badly treated drivers are. We were talking about how our NHS here in Scotland is in crisis, and those were the big things coming up.
How many people brought up drivers with you?
Zero.
Quite a few people.
How many? Go on, how many? I mean, the Prime Minister was talking about all last week, and he just seemed to be using it as some kind of smokescreen for the HS2 decision that he was going to have to make.
No,
I mean,
no,
are people really bringing up problems with the roads with you at a Westminster by-election?
Yes, they are. Really? They're talking about the quality of the roads, they're talking about the state of the roads, they're also talking about...
Rather than the cost of living crisis.
This is what the biggest thing that people talk about on the doorstep was the quality of the roads, and also there was conversations about buses, conversations about taxis, difficulties in the way they're accessing the centre of Glasgow. There's a lot of things that came up, and just because it's a Westminster by-election doesn't mean that people don't care about what's going on locally.
Kirsten's looking on incredulously.
I am feeling a wee bit incredulous. I have knocked on hundreds and hundreds of doors, and I can hear Ian murmuring beside me. So, you know,
he's murmuring agreement, to be fair.
Uncharacteristically be agreeing with each other
agreed on anything.
Well, it would have to happen at some point. But, you know, I don't know which doors you were knocking on, Sandesh, or where they were. These are not the issues that came up on the doorstep. People are concerned about the cost of living crisis. I would certainly like to push back to Ian about the two-child cap. I think it's not only indefensible, your position, but it's also incongruous with your candidate's position. But what Sandesh is saying, it just makes difficult hearing for those of us who've been on the ground.
The average mortgage holder in Rutherglen and Hamilton West is £220 a month worse off because this party crashed the economy. Nobody's talking about the roads.
Briefly.
Oh, it's very simple. You know, the SNP are in charge of Scotland. We're going to see a huge rise in council tax, potentially from the SNP government.
We'll probably come back to that as a new issue to take into the debate in a wee while. But if Labour takes this constituency from the SNP tonight, it will only be the 6th seat in 35 years to change hands at a Scottish Westminster by-election. In a piece which contains some flash photography, Bernard has been taking a trip down memory lane to remember the other 5.
Jim Siller's Scottish National Party, no poll tax, 14,000.
Govern 1988 and the SNP capture a safe Labour seat on a swing of 33%. The by-election solidified opposition to the poll tax and was evidence that a period on the electoral margins was at an end for the Nationalists.
Mrs Thatcher's government doesn't have a single shred of credibility north of the border after last night.
But it returned to Labour at the general election in 1992.
Ian Graham Davidson, the Labour and Cooperative Party candidate, 17,051.
Kincardine and Deeside in 1991 was a typical by-election protest.
Can I say First of all, we did it.
Nicol Stephen won it for the Liberal Democrats with a 7,000 majority, but it was recaptured by George Kynott for the Conservatives just 7 months later at the general election.
I stood here 3 years ago and promised the people of Perth and Kinross that I would be back, and I am back.
The Perth and Kinross by-election in 1995 was an SNP gain from the Conservatives, and it ushered a sustained period of SNP domination in the area. Further evidence that the Nationalists were a potent threat in Tory heartland seats.
I couldn't have done it without all of you!
Willie Rennie went to Westminster when he captured Dunfermline and West Fife for the Liberal Democrats in 2006. He was the beneficiary of a protest vote against the new Labour government.
Tonight, they have sent a powerful message to the Labour government that will rock the foundations of Downing Street.
But it returned to Labour at the general election in 2010 in echoes of Kincardine and Deeside. And a swing from Labour to the SNP of 22.5% propelled John Mason to a 365-vote majority in Glasgow East in 2008.
Tonight we have removed the dead hand of Labour control.
Like Dunfermline, it was the stuff of protest, and the seat returned to Labour in 2010 with a whopping Labour majority of nearly 12,000. Some by-elections are but short-term flashes of discontent. Others have a more profound significance. The question tonight, into which category will Rutherglen and Hamilton West fall?
What do you think, Bernard? Where's it going to fall? And how big a deal are these by-elections, given that you keep saying they all go back to the main, or not all, but mostly go back to the other party?
I'm basically
anyway.
saying that they're either classic protest votes and they go back, or they signify a much more fundamental change in the political weather. I would put my head in the chopping block, and I may well look very stupid at the general election next year. I think it's the latter category, because what tonight may well signify is the high point of the SNP being the dominant electoral force in Scotland is going to be under challenge as never before since 2007, when they won that one-seat victory in the Scottish Parliament elections then. And momentum in politics is everything. And if a narrative takes hold that the SNP have lost here, and depending on the size of the swing, and that is important, it means that a whole series of SNP seats at the general election could be at risk. We could be going back to this result tonight and saying that is potentially where the rot set in. So it's the ability of this result tonight to be a springboard for Labour to make an assault on a whole series of SNP constituencies in the central belt of Scotland. The story of tonight, I would suggest, is probably that Labour are back as a credible electoral force. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to sweep the board in Scotland at the general election whenever it comes.
You've lost momentum.
I'm not sure that that is the case, but, you know, like all parties, we will look at the result, which we don't know yet, and, you know, assess where we think we need to go. And our eyes are on the general election. You know, Bernard himself has said that, you know, a by-election isn't a predictor of a general election. I think that's very true. I think this is a very specific set of circumstances that we've been dealing with here, you know, a particular cause for the by-election, particularly challenging time. But we have our eye on the general election next year. Nobody knows exactly when that will be. You know, we're looking at all of the policies that we would want to try and bring forward to improve people's lives and to continue to improve the lives of people in Scotland. You know, Ian has said that he, you you know, is not in favour of dealing with the two-child cap. I don't understand why. Sandesh is facing his party being squeezed to a really tiny number of votes at this by-election. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of balls that we'll have in the air, but fundamentally we're looking forward. We're looking forward to the general election, and we will absolutely fight to win in every seat in Scotland.
Ian, I accept that momentum can be a triggering word for you in the Labour Party. You know, you were talking about getting your mojo back. You've got the momentum here, haven't you?
Well, look, I don't know. The one thing that didn't show, that great video there from Bernard, and seeing all these young faces of politicians before.
Oh, and how they've aged.
And how they have aged. The only person that hasn't aged in that package is Bernard himself. But when you look at that...
You're currying no favour here, you know.
But what you didn't see in that is where the polls were and where the trends in the polls were in the run-up to those elections. And it's quite clear that, yes, of course, polls are polls, but the trends in the polls are massively upwards for Labour, down for the SNP, down for the Conservatives, and this is actually crosses in ballot boxes, which is hugely important to try and underpin what the polls are telling us. And that's when you get that seismic shift in politics, which is why I think tonight could be the latter in terms of a change in Scottish politics rather than the former, on the basis that if the boxes and the crosses in the boxes match or beat the polls tonight, then you can start extrapolating a whole series of trends from that. We're pretty confident going to the next election because the public are telling us that they want rid of this Conservative government and they're willing to vote to do that. But David Linden there, I mean, his message for the SNP was the voters have got this wrong. And I think if that's the message that David Linden takes out of this as the general election coordinator for the SNP, then they're in for a hiding to nothing.
Well, we're about to see Michael Shanks arriving at the count, hopefully in the next few minutes. So we'll cut to those pictures when that happens. But Sandesh Gulhani isn't the problem for the Conservatives, is that, you know, all the polls are showing just how much your vote seems to be collapsing in Scotland. And the fact that you're so far behind Labour at a UK level as well. You know, we were talking about momentum. You've got none coming out of your party conference, really.
Well, if you look around the country, up and down Scotland, we're very positive in the areas that we are campaigning in. We are very positive that people around Scotland...
You've been campaigning in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. You're not being positive about that.
So this seat is unique. But if we talk about... We'll come back to this seat. But if we talk about Scotland as a whole, we are up and down talking to people on the doors, and there's a very positive reception. It's the SNP narrative of being overconfident, and you can hear that from Humza when he talks in Chamber all the time about being overconfident, being arrogant, and actually we're seeing this change.
I've got to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not hearing much overconfidence or arrogance coming from Kirsten tonight.
It is
but not from Kirsten Oswald. She's almost conceded defeat earlier on.
I certainly have conceded nothing. But I think it's a bit much to come in here and say that about the First Minister. I don't think that that's accurate at all. And it certainly isn't answering the question, although I'm sure Colin will take that up with you separately.
Oh, and then if we talk about...
Hang on, we're just going back to the count just now because there's Anas Sarwar and Michael Shanks arriving at the count. It looks like they're getting some kind of victory salute from their own party supporters there. There's Paul O'Kane, another Labour MSP welcoming them. He's been very active during this campaign. I've got to say, I think Anas Sarwar has been out in Rutherglen pretty much every day of the last few months of this campaign. I've never seen a kind of turnout from a party leader just like that. So that shows how much work and how much effort they've been putting in to this campaign. I mean, Anas Sarwar has been going around the door speaking to some of the doubtful voters, maybe perhaps some of the people that Ian was talking about earlier who have switched from party to party during this election. Now they are posing for the assembled cameras as their supporters clap and cheer them. Ian, you must be pretty delighted to see something like that going on this early in the process.
I mean, it's great because Anas is led from the front, as you've already mentioned, and Michael is I mean, I know we always talk about the candidates being superb, but Michael is a teacher. He was teaching locally, doing his training. He runs a disabled scout group at the weekends. He's done that for 15 years in his own time. He sits on the board of Epilepsy Scotland. This guy's steeped in public service, and do you know what? Every door he went on, whether they were voting for him or not, and whether or not they were voting for any other party, they really connected with Michael because he's just such a lovely guy, and he'll represent Rutherglen and Hamilton West if he's lucky enough to win brilliantly well. And I think the quality of the candidate, the quality of the campaign, and the leadership shown by Anas Sarwar has been exemplary in this, and I hope the result reflects the fact that they've put everything into it and deserve to get something back
How often
out.
has Keir Starmer been up during this campaign? Because we've seen an
I
awful
think.
lot more of him than we've seen from any other UK party leader at a Scottish by-election for a long time, certainly as long as I can remember.
Of course, because Keir, as you said at the start of the programme, really cares about Scotland. He really wants Scottish MPs to be part of the new Labour government for that mandate right across the country, but also it's the same message. It's the message of change, it's the message of hope, and I hope that's what this by-election's given the country, that this country can change. The voters of Rutherglen and Hamilton West on the doorsteps are hungry for change, they're desperate for change, and they're very disappointed with what they're getting at the moment.
Now, we were talking about Humza Yousaf a minute ago, the new leader of the SNP this year. Do you think that he has been a selling point for your party on the doorsteps?
I think he
has. He been out much?
Actually, he's been out a great deal, and I'm really appreciative of that. He's got a big job to do, and he nonetheless has made the time to be very present and very visible in this campaign, which our activists and our candidate Katie Loudon have also appreciated. But I think he is an asset on the doors. People like the fact that he's very open. They like the fact that he's willing to listen to them. I think that really matters in a leader, and he's obviously somebody who is willing to lead from the front, and I think that is particularly helpful.
How does he compare with voters to Nicola Sturgeon?
I mean, I guess they're quite different in some
Nicola
ways.
Sturgeon's been around a long time and led.
There's a familiarity.
Hang on, we're going to cut to Anas Sarwar, who's at the count. We just don't have the sound. There's some kind of connection problem there. But sorry, you were saying, Kirsten?
I think that Humza's obviously quite new into the job, but nonetheless, people have got a good deal of recognition. They are appreciative of the fact that he is there leading from the front, whether that be the country or whether that was the by-election campaign as well. So I think that he does that with good grace, and people appreciate that.
OK, we're just going to cut back to the count because I think we've got the sound to Anas Sarwar.
And an economic crisis. People are demanding change, and the only vehicle for change is now the Scottish Labour Party.
You sound totally confident of victory. By what margin?
Well, look, you need to wait till the results are counted, but I think we're really confident of doing a really strong showing in this constituency and getting a really positive, strong result that can be a springboard going into the next election. But let me emphasise one thing to people right across Scotland. When I took on this job 2 years ago, I did it with humility. I did it recognising that we had a long journey to go and that we would work hard for every vote to earn people's trust and deserve to win again. This is only one further step in that journey. That journey is still far from complete. And so to everyone that's voted for us in this constituency, thank you. We won't let you down. But this is not the end. This is just the start of rebuilding something special, building something really special for our country and delivering the change that Scotland needs.
With a very low turnout, though, are people really enthusiastic?
Well, look, it's a higher turnout than there was in the Airdrie Shotts by-election that we had just a couple of years ago. Of course, we want to encourage as many people as possible to come out and vote in every election, regardless of which political party they support, because that's democracy. But I honestly believe that our message going into the next general election will be even stronger than this by-election. In this by-election, people had an opportunity to send a message to two failing governments and to demand change. At the next general election, people have an opportunity to actually vote for change, and there is now no rival in the campaign for change to the Scottish Labour Party. We are now the vehicle for that change for people right across the country.
Thanks very much, guys. Lots of chances later.
Sandesh Gohani, we were just talking earlier to the other two political parties about the leadership impact of the campaign. I haven't really noticed. Has Douglas Ross been in Rutherglen and Hamilton West?
Of course Douglas
How
has
often?
been.
Has he been there much?
But yes, Douglas has been. He's knocked on doors. He's gone around delivering leaflets.
What kind of reaction do you get about him on the doors then?
Well, the voters are very clear in this election, and I was saying that a little bit earlier. This is a unique set of circumstances. You talked about momentum. You talked about that being a triggering word, but actually, Labour held that with Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. So this is a unique set of circumstances where we are seeing quite clearly.
Yeah, but how does Douglas Ross play on the doorsteps?
He plays fine.
Which is what I asked you.
He plays fine on the doorsteps. He was there talking to people. He was listening to people's issues that they're having, and he's very clear
about potholes.
Well, That is a big issue, and all over Glasgow, in fact, it's a big issue. But he's very clear about Scotland's real alternative.
Bernard, you wanted to swing in.
Yeah, I mean, Anas Sarwar referenced the Airdrie Shotts by-election, and the Airdrie Shotts by-election was quite an interesting by-election, and the result was interesting. It was interesting because the Labour Party closed the gap on the SNP in Airdrie Shotts. But if you actually look at the result, and I think it's on the screen now, although Labour actually closed the gap in the SNP's share of the vote actually was marginally up compared to the general election. Now, what happened in that constituency was that Conservative voters who knew they were not going to get a Conservative Member of Parliament tactically got behind Labour. Now, again, if the Conservative vote collapses in this constituency because they go behind Labour, it's still not enough to get Labour over the line. Labour can only win in this constituency if people who were voting SNP actually start voting Labour. Now, right at the top of the programme, Ewing was saying that the rumours were that the swing might be 7 or 8%. Then we went back to him. He was saying it perhaps is 10%, suggestions that it's actually probably going to be nearer 15%. What would that mean on the existing parliamentary boundaries if there was a general election tomorrow? A swing of 5% would mean that Labour would gain 4 seats. A swing of 8% would give Labour 11 seats. A swing of 10% would give Labour 16 seats. And a swing of 11%, you're probably looking at 20 seats. Now, it's important to say what happens in a by-election is not replicated totally at a general election, but it is a snapshot of opinion and at any one point. And of course, in politics, momentum is everything. And the broader message of tonight is probably that Labour are back in business and the SNP have a fight in their hands electorally that they haven't had for years.
Ian Murray, when the Fabian Society looked at the target seats in Scotland, they were giving you the figures that Bernard was talking about there. The Labour Together review at that point after 2019 reckoned that you needed to win 15 seats from the SNP. Is that still what you're aiming for, or are you going to put that up after something like tonight, potentially?
Well, look, Bernard's right, because you do want to... This is just a snapshot of opinion. It is a by-election. There's a whole host of circumstances around that. But what we're looking at tonight is the underpinning of the polls and the underpinning of the trends. We did poll 18.6% at the 29 general election. We're polling mid-30s at the moment in all the pollsters, and of course polls are up and down, but the last 22 polls, bar the last one, had Labour gaining on the SNP. If we have an actual election, which is what we've got tonight, that underpins or beats those polls, then you can start being ambitious in terms of where you might want to go. But what we're looking at here is that we've always said that the road to Downing Street runs through Scotland. That was a bold claim when Keir Starmer first became leader.
But you could win the election in England.
This could be the very first step on getting Scottish Labour MPs in that red column to make it much easier to get a Labour majority at the next general election. And that's what we're all working very hard for.
How concerned are you about the potential size of the swing tonight, Kirsten, in terms of, you know, the number of seats that you could lose? You know, if it's 10%, as Bernard says, well, it's what Ewan was saying, in fact, he's hearing at the count, it could be. That takes you, that would mean that would cost you about 16 seats if that was repeated across the country.
I think we have to be a wee bit careful about extrapolating what is a very specific by-election.
Of course we do, because this is just a one-off.
Because it's simply not the same thing.
And we talked about the levels of activism and campaigning. You know, that's not going to be replicated in the general election either. But you must be having some concerns.
I mean, I think, you know, we will all, we'll never take, you know, any vote for granted. We'll always want to work very hard to make sure that we take our message to the voters and we take our message to the doorsteps. That's absolutely the case. And I think that as we come up towards a general election, the choices are going to be quite stark for people in Scotland. Are they going to want to support this Westminster system, which is squashing their ability to deal with the cost of living, or something better?
I mean, the health warnings are important. It is a by-election. The turnout at a general election will be much higher. The issues might be the same, but how they play will be different. And critically, what we're talking about is swings based upon existing boundaries. The general election is likely to be fought on new boundaries. In fact, this constituency tonight will be substantially redrawn by the time that we get to the general election. And therefore what will happen is that the psephologists in due course will come up with notional results in the new constituencies. But the key thing is trend, and what the trends tell us is the SNP have a fight in their hands.
Well, let's see what Ewan's going to tell us, because he's at the count in Hamilton. Ewan, what have you got to tell us?
Well, we're looking to be in the latter stages of this count now, so hopefully we're looking at a declaration shortly after 1 o'clock or so. Michael Shanks and Anna Sarwar, after the media huddle down here, are now disappeared upstairs, probably for a cup of tea and a chat. I'm joined here, though, by Paul O'Kane, the Scottish Labour MSP. Paul, there seems to be widespread agreement you're going to win. The question is, by how much? What are you predicting?
Well, look, you know, I think what we've seen today is a hugely positive response to our campaign. We've had people out in the doors all day showing, I think, that positivity of our message of change in Scottish Labour. So I think we expect to see a result that will be a good result for us. But at the moment, we're still counting votes, obviously. But we are really pleased that our message of change seems to have been resonating across Rutherglen and Hamilton West today.
The crucial question, though, is where are these votes coming from? Is this a tactical vote, or are you actually gaining support from SNP supporters?
Well, look, I've been working on this by-election for 6 months, like countless other Labour activists in the community and our great candidate Michael Shanks. I've been speaking to hundreds of voters who are telling me that many of them lifelong Labour voters, many of them formerly SNP voters who are disillusioned, who want to see change, who feel that the SNP have completely lost their way. And of course, Tory voters as well, who see a party that is corrupt, that is not managing the economy of the UK in a progressive way, and are turning to alternatives. So I think it's been a broad coalition, and all the people I've spoken to have come back to Labour for a variety of different reasons.
Can you read anything into this for next year, though, for the general election, on such a low turnout when all the other parties say their votes are being squeezed in order to vote for you tactically? Can you read anything from this for next year?
Well, look, on turnout, you know, we saw a turnout that was higher than the Airdrie Shotts by-election, the most recent Westminster by-election in Scotland. We saw a turnout that was roughly half of the general election turnout here in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. So I think what we will see tonight, we hope, is a clear indication that people want change. They want change with Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar. They want to move on from the divisions of the past. And they see two governments, a Tory government at Westminster and an SNP government at Holyrood, that are failing people and are not delivering on people's priorities.
OK, Paul O'Kane, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us tonight, and hopefully we'll get another update on when that declaration will come very soon.
Or even just the result. Thanks, Ewan.
They don't have a lot of votes to count.
They've not got that many. There's only 30,000.
I mean, at the general election, Colin, when the turnouts are well over 60%, many, many more votes, they're normally declaring about 1 o'clock. I don't know what's keeping them.
I know, yeah, I'm wondering that. But I mean, maybe, well, one of the things that Paul was talking about there was tactical voting. How big a thing is tactical voting in Scotland now? Because what I've seen over the last few years, particularly at Holyrood elections, but increasingly at general elections, is a very sophisticated electorate in Scotland. They know how to get rid of someone, and they know how to get someone in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for Conservative voters in this constituency, in 2019, 8,000 people voted Conservative, 15% of the electorate in this constituency. In other Lanarkshire constituencies, the Conservatives were actually polling much higher than 15%, which is why, across the country, they got 25%. So tactical voting has always been with us. If I can offer maybe a crumb of comfort to the Conservatives tonight, that 25% in 2019 was as a result of 8,000 votes in Rutherglen and Hamilton West and a whole series of constituencies where the Conservatives had no chance of winning, but they stockpiled votes after votes after votes, and that gave you the 25% across the country. Now, these votes at the next election, where they can't win, you may well see massive tactical transfers towards Labour, but you will not see the same in constituencies either which the Conservatives hold or where the Conservatives are the challengers. Hence the reason that the Liberal Democrats, I think in 2019, lost more deposits in that election than any other previous election, and yet in the constituencies where the Liberal Democrats were strong, they held on. I suspect that the story for the Conservatives at the next election is that they will go back into their rural fiefdoms, and the votes that they were getting in Central Belt constituencies will go tactically behind Labour.
If that's the case, Sandesh Gulhani, how difficult will it be for you at, for example, a general election, the next big test, to persuade other unionist voters from the Labour Party or the Lib Dems to back the Conservatives when their voters want rid of your government?
I don't think that's the case at all in areas around Scotland, especially in places that we are currently holding. You know, what I hear on the door is they want the SNP out, quite frankly, and they've had enough of this.
But at a general election, that's not really an option. They might want the SNP MP out, but if you're talking about seats that the Conservatives already hold and you need to persuade Labour and Lib Dem voters to switch to you during that general election, that's going to be tough when what they really want to see is you guys out of Downing Street.
So, again, the doors I'm knocking on, people that I'm speaking to, overwhelmingly, they want the SNP out. They want the SNP that represents them out. And when we are the closest challengers, people are willing to vote for us.
Colin, on this issue, I mean, the Conservatives have 8 target seats in mind, where marginal constituencies, and the definition of a marginal constituency is one where the swing required is 5% or less. There are 8 constituencies which would fall to the Conservatives on a swing of 5% or less. Gordon, Ayr, Carrington, Cumnock, Oakland South, Pershore, Argyll, Bute, Angus, East Lothian, Lanark and Hamilton East, and Renfrewshire East on that particular swing. The problem is that if they're not doing well in the polls and they're well down from the 2019 levels of support, and the polls suggest that they are indeed well down from the 2019 levels of support, these target seats are no longer target seats because they ain't going to win them.
See, isn't the problem for the Conservatives is that that's what Anas Sarwar was saying, is that he's saying that Labour is the vehicle for change. Now, this week we had the Prime Minister claiming that he was the vehicle for change. Not from himself. He can't be changed from himself. This is going to be a hard sell for you on the doorsteps, claiming that a party who's been in government at Westminster for 13 years is a party of change.
Well, the SNP have been in charge of Scotland for 16 disastrous years, quite frankly. So what we will be talking about when we are the closest challengers to the SNP, that's the message that people understand, and that's the message they keep telling us time and time again. They want the representative.
But you're not telling me how you're going to make this image that you're the party of change work when you've been in government for 13 years.
Well, look at the things.
I mean, you keep changing Prime Minister, but that's a different matter.
Well, look at the things that our Prime Minister is doing at the moment. And, you know, if you look at the progressive policy that he has about smoking, you know, what a positive message to give. Whilst the SNP are tinkering around the edges with the MUP, which frankly doesn't work, we're talking
They're
about...
completely different. You're comparing apples and pears. They're almost literally.
Well, actually, so alcohol, we know, is a harmful substance. So is tobacco smoking. But that kills more people. You get more cancer than anything else. And this is a progressive change, which would mean we'll have a smoke-free generation.
To be fair, there will be a tobacco control bill coming in the Scottish Parliament in the next few months as well. Kirsten, you wanted to come in. Are they all ganging up on you?
Well, I'm
with
just
this tactical voting?
slightly confused by where Sandesh was going with all of these different topics. But you know, I don't know where he thinks that the ban on smoking in public places arrived from. It was from the Scottish Parliament. It was an SNP MSP who brought that forward. But I don't think that's. I think it was Stuart Maxwell. But
it's actually Kenny Gibson at first.
Well, there you go. So
and then he lost his seat, and then Stuart Maxwell took it up. But it was supported by Jack McConnell's government. Yeah,
it came from the Scottish Parliament, and you know, I think that might be, you know, the point that I would want to make to Sandesh. But you know, in terms of the situation we're dealing with here, in terms of the voters of Rutherglen and Hamilton West, it's undeniable that the Conservatives are being squeezed to a very, very small number of voters.
They're being squeezed against you. They're being squeezed, still voting against you.
Well,
they're
perhaps
voting
there's
tactically.
a coalescence of some of the policy ideas, and you know, that's. I think an undeniable truth. I would love to hear more from you.
No, I think they just want rid of the SNP, though, don't they?
David Linden, I think, came out with the point that Kirsten is just making. But I mean, the SNP have a question which they have to ask themselves, because they're saying that in this by-election, Labour cannot be trusted to deliver for poor people on the cost of living crisis. And David Linden, in that interview clip with you and earlier on, was saying that they've marched away to the right. They've gone away to the right. So if that's true, if that caricature is actually true, then the SNP have to ask themselves why they've voted for a party which, according to them, have gone to the right and not voted SNP.
And that's the arrogance of David Linden that I was talking about earlier, because even if the Conservatives lose their deposit tonight and 10% of that 15% that they got at the last general election comes to Labour, we still haven't got enough to win. And if we're talking about the kind of swing that we're looking at tonight, upwards of a dozen%, maybe more, then
you're raising the bar even higher now.
I'm happy to raise the bar, but the question for Kirsten and for David Linden is, where has the SNP vote gone? And you can't simply just dismiss this as tactical voting. And what's going to happen at the next general election isn't going to be tactical voting for parties. People are going to tactically vote for change. This party is not offering it, and this party hasn't offered it, and people are desperate for change. That's what they're telling us every day on the doorstep. So the best that we can hear from the Conservative Party is that people are going to vote for the next election because they're going to ban smoking over a generation. Then I think people will see that this Conservative government are offering nothing.
Ian's talking up the possibility of a swing of 12%. Let's put this into some sort of by-election context. 2005 in Livingston, swing was 10.2% from Labour to the SNP. In Dunfermline and West Fife, the swing is 16% from Labour to the Liberal Democrats. Glasgow East, 22.6%, Labour to the SNP. Glenrothes, a swing of 6.6% from Liberal Democrat to Labour. So the point that I make is that if the swing is between 10 and 15%, not unusual in a by-election, but it gets back to the point. Is it just a protest which is going to go back to the SNP at the general election, or is it a portent of a realignment of the electoral calculus? That's the key thing.
And also, if you're looking at potentially a 12% swing, you're looking at getting almost 50% of the vote again. That's what you're aiming for, isn't it?
Well,
tonight.
Let's see what the swing looks like. I'm hearing
you were speculating yourself on 12%. It was you that came up with that.
I'm hearing some very positive noises coming through that it might even be better than that. And that's because people are voting positively for the Labour Party, whether they're Liberal Democrats, Greens, Conservatives or the SNP, they're voting for the Labour Party today. It's matching the polls and showing that the polls might be correct. The trends are all in the right direction. And we've got this ludicrous situation that a number of people said to me on the doorsteps over the last month, that the new prospectus from the SNP is that they'll call independence, not just a referendum, but they'll call independence if they win the largest number of MPs at the next general election. On that kind of swing, they certainly wouldn't be.
Kirsten, I did say we'll come back to the Constitution, and we will, but not quite yet. If he's looking at a 12% plus swing now, he's adding to it. Every time we speak to him, he adds to it.
It's playing your cards right, isn't it?
Absolutely. Higher, lower. Yes, we moved on from Bernard's bingo. But Kirsten, you're looking at quite a big loss to your vote. Have your voters just not bothered to turn out today? Is that we talked earlier about momentum? Is this motivation now? You're struggling to motivate them now.
I mean, we'll have to look at all of that, and it's probably a wee bit soon
but do you feel that there's been a bit of that it's been difficult to motivate them to come out?
It is a challenging circumstance. You know, we've accepted that from the beginning.
So has it been difficult to motivate them to come out? Is that been a big problem for you?
I found today quite positive on the doorsteps, but obviously, you know, we'll see what the numbers actually tell us, won't we, when we get to the declaration. But, you know, I think that it would be ludicrous to say anything other than we'll, of course, look carefully at what the result is. We certainly will do that. We never take anybody's vote for granted, and we'll want to have a look at, you know, where we are and where we get to.
You have been taking their votes for granted.
That's not the case. And, you know, I mean, in this seat itself, you know, it's swung back and forth since 2010.
It's a yo-yo seat, isn't it?
So, I think it would be...
So hang on, are you saying it's just his turn?
No, I'm saying that it's a seat which has moved about a bit. It's a seat where we're looking at a by-election and, you know, very particular circumstances. This is a unique situation. We've never faced a situation like this. Yeah, and we're also looking at the figures that Bernard spoke about. So a by-election in itself is a unique beast. So there's an awful lot in there. I think it would be sensible for us to have a good look at that, and we'll certainly do that. But it is impossible, I think, for us to pin down, you know, exactly whether, you know, people didn't come out who could have.
I'm not trying to pin it down.
I
just think, is there a factor that has been difficult to motivate your supporters?
I haven't seen that on the doors, but we will look at that, of course, and I haven't seen it in activists either, so, you know, again, I appreciate that from them.
Up until Sunday of last week, we had spoken to 33,000 people in this constituency. And I would
That's
say
more than bothered to turn out to vote.
Well, I would say to Kirsten that she really needs to go back and listen to what those people have been saying, because this isn't just about a by-election, it's not just about a protest. There's a deep-rooted problem here for the SNP. Hamza Yousaf said he'd take personal responsibility for the by-election itself. What kind of swing is acceptable to Hamza Yousaf? What kind of swing is not acceptable to the SNP? This could be a really seismic shift in Scottish politics, which would have a seismic shift for British politics. And I think just dismissing this as a by-election with swings greater elsewhere in years gone by really dismisses the voters in terms of what they're saying. They are sending messages tonight to the Conservatives and the SNP, and if they're cloth-eared, they'll get what they deserve at the ballot box.
I mean, there are people within the SNP, of course, who have been debating and questioning, you know, what is the referendum strategy? How do you take it forward? We had the de facto referendum of the former First Minister. Then there was a refinement of that strategy. I mean, if you're in the run-up to a general election, and it looks as if your vote is going, in terms of percentage share, is going to be materially down, and you start losing a lot of seats, however you define what the mandate for independence is, however you define it, then the electoral calculus may well suggest that you ain't going to get there. And that is in the context where it is likely that the next general election will be fought in a cost of living crisis, and for the first time in quite a long time, perhaps, just perhaps, the general election will not be fought through the prism of the constitutional question. I mean, this really, this result will trigger a lot of soul-searching within the SNP, and a lot of people will be asking themselves, and there will be some people within the independence movement, this is what happens when you don't keep banging the drum for independence.
I'll come to you, Kirsten, in a minute, but Sandesh, the whole issue of the Constitution has been played up in a big way at elections for a number of years now by the Conservatives. You've coasted a bit on this as well, playing the unionist card. It might not work for you at the next general election. I think it's what they're all saying tonight.
It's very clear that we are the party for the union and we are very strong on the union. But look, line 1, page 1 is what Humza said, that he would put independence. That's not what we're going to say. We talk about Scotland's real alternative. We talk about Scotland's real issues, and that's what we need to talk about. We need to talk about our health service. We need to talk about crime. We need to talk about how badly the SNP are letting down people when it comes to transport.
But we're talking about the Constitution just now. Now, I can let the viewers know that we're expecting a result, hopefully in the next 15 minutes or so. So now I am going to go back to the Constitution. I've been threatening this all night. I've been putting it off, but given that we're only potentially 15 minutes away from a result, let's go to that. So when it comes down to the cost of living, rather than the Constitution, as Bernard says, it does look like the next election is going to be played out. That is going to be difficult for you. And I come back to that whole motivation thing. If your voters are motivated by the prospect of independence, if you can't show them any sign that there is a real prospect of that just round the corner, you're going to struggle, aren't you?
I think that these things are interlinked. So the cost of living is a huge issue for people. It's something that we not only talk about but act on.
So you have to link that to independence?
Well, I think it is linked. So independence is not a notion that has no underpinning reason behind it. You know, the whole reason for independence is to make people's lives better in Scotland. That's the whole point of this. So, you know, that's something that I do look forward to having more conversations with people about. People are interested in this. I'm looking forward to our conference next week where we'll have a series of discussions about the detail of that. And that is important. You know, the democratic process to get to policy positions is important as well. Well, if you want to come back to me after we've had this discussion at our conference, I'll be very happy to tell you what the policy position will be. But I'm not going to prejudge.
Surely you can tell me what you think a mandate for independence is just now. I'm sure everybody else could.
But I think that it would be a bit odd of me to prejudge what the policy position is going to be that comes out of that independence focus at conference.
Ian.
So
The policy's been announced. Hamza Yousaf has said the policy is that the largest number of seats at the next general election wouldn't just trigger a referendum, it would trigger discussions for independence.
He's also said that could be amended
words.
at their conference.
And the conference has, you know, the
Which means
paperwork
that
for
we
that
still
is
don't
out.
know.
So let's get
So
to
maybe
next
it's not
week.
just you that doesn't know, maybe nobody in the party knows at the moment.
I don't think that's right. You know, so Hamza, I think, has been very clear
Well,
about where he wants to go with
hang on,
this.
if that's not right, you'll be able to tell me just now what's a mandate for independence.
So Hamza has spoken about this. He's spoken about the number of seats, but he has, as you've said that this is something that we will discuss further at our conference. We've been having a conversation about this for the past number of months in our party, and that will be the conclusion of that.
Well, that's the thing. Is it a majority of seats? Is it just winning the most seats in Scotland? What is it?
Well, I'm not going to prejudge what the outcome of that conference discussion will be, because I can't possibly do that.
Isn't the reality, given that we've had 2015 when you were all but 3 seats, we've had 2017 and 2019 where you won the majority of seats in Scotland, and you go nowhere closer to a referendum. So it makes no difference at all, does it there?
Well, there's the whole point.
The general election makes no difference
the
to you.
democratic deficit that Scotland faces, doesn't it? And, you know, then you've got people like Ian who said, you know, under no circumstances should we ever be able to have a referendum. Scotland does have to have the right to choose its future. Whatever, you know, your different views on the Constitution might be, and people are entitled to all of their different views, it is surely the right of people in Scotland to decide what their future should be.
That was certainly what everyone agreed in 2014, that was the right of the Scottish people to decide their future. Do you still go along with that?
Well, we had the process works, doesn't it? Because we had a referendum in 2014. And do you know what? This is the first discussion I've had about the Constitution in this entire by-election, because nobody's talking about it. People are sick, fed up of it. They can't pay their heating bills, they can't pay their mortgages or their rent, they're worried about their children's futures, and all the SNP are blithering on about is another independence referendum, or indeed independence if they win the largest number of seats. Look, if this swing is 13% or above...
You've gone up another percent. Every time we come back to you,
keep coming back,
I'll
stop eventually. Then Labour could be looking at, you know, potentially, and again, all the caveats that Bernard's already said, upwards of 24 seats. And if this is the kind of message that Hamza Yousaf has given to the Scottish people, then they're turning away from it. They've turned away from this by-election. I've never mentioned it. I think I've heard about roads more than I've heard about the Constitution.
We're just looking at pictures from the count just now, and we can see Katie Loudon. Well, we could until somebody stood up in front of the camera there. They're dodging up and down. We said it's a yo-yo seat. There's somebody dodging up and down there. I couldn't get any impression of what she looked like from that count. But did you get anything there, Kirsten?
No, I got that was Katie Loudon. Delighted to see her.
She is at the count, we can guarantee
she
that.
She has been an exceptional candidate.
We're back now.
Happy to see her there. She's worked really hard.
She is smiling, but it doesn't look like a big cheesy smile.
Colin, by-elections are tough. They're tough for the winners, they're tough for the losers, everyone that gets involved. Nothing but admiration for people who put themselves forward as candidates, particularly in by-elections. So everyone deserves...
Is it tougher than a general election or any other election?
Much tougher, because the focus of the entire country is on you, particularly in a by-election like this that could have such seismic consequences for British politics. The light is on you very, very strongly. So I agree with Kirsten, nothing but admiration for the candidates that have been put forward.
The county buildings, of course, is where the count is taking place, and way back in November '67, of course, when Winnie Ewing had that triumph, one of the biggest swings in by-election history. Winnie Ewing said something...
Biggest in Scotland, certainly,
biggest
wasn't
Scotland. Winnie Ewing said something... Oh, it was more than that.
You're not getting anywhere near that tonight, I don't think.
It was 33%.
It was 33% in Govan, wasn't it? It was about 45%
it was more towards 40% in Hamilton. But on this issue about how difficult these are for candidates, Winnie Ewing once said that in a by-election, every candidate suffers from winningitis. They all think they're winning even if they're subsequently losing their deposit. And that's because, by and large, most voters that politicians meet, most voters are actually very pleasant with people on the doorstep. You get very few people that will be rude and chase you away. And sometimes candidates are lulled into a false sense of security. I actually think that the 3 candidates for the main parties were all good in their own way. I
was just going to say that. Actually, the debate last week, I thought all 3 of the candidates were actually decent, good candidates.
I thought the Conservative candidate was the best debater.
And certainly the wittiest.
And certainly the wittiest. I thought the Labour candidate was the smoothest presentationally. And I thought the SNP candidate knowing that she was probably behind it, did a reasonable job about taking the arguments to Labour.
One of the things about that debate last week was that it was just the three parties that we have in the studio tonight who were represented. Now, we only invited the four of the parties to take part in it because they were the ones who had saved their deposit in previous elections, actually shown a decent representation in that constituency. The Lib Dems didn't want to take part, though. Does that show just how tough it can be for a candidate that they wouldn't even take part in the only televised debate of the campaign? Because
live television is very unforgiving, and it's a very, very difficult experience. I mean, that by-election in '88, which Jim Sillars won for the SNP, after the live STV debate, the Labour Party changed its rules on how it should select by-election candidates because it was judged that the STV debate, which came 3 days before polling, was so bad for Labour that they could only select candidates in the future who were capable of standing up to the specific pressures of a by-election. And indeed, 6 or 7 months later, when we had a by-election in Glasgow Central, when Alec Neil was the SNP candidate, Mike Watson was media trained to death, and so you had this political earthquake in November 1988 in Govan. Just a matter of months later, June 1989, despite the fact that the SNP got a swing from Labour in that by-election, Labour held the seat because they had a candidate who was more media savvy.
I'm just thinking back to that 1988 by-election. That debate was probably chaired by Colin Mackay as well, wasn't it? But a different one.
A different one.
A different one. A much more senior and authoritative one than I could ever pretend to be.
An august presence.
Absolutely,
I
yes.
was in bed because I had school in the morning.
I'm sure you probably all were, actually, weren't you?
I was in bed because I had school in the morning.
So, if Labour are to take this seat tonight...
With 14+%.
14+%, right? It's almost like an auction here. Where does this fit into the whole kind of pantheon of Scottish by-elections that we were discussing in Bernard's film earlier on?
Well, I think history will show that it's probably been the turning point in the journey to majority Labour government. I mean, we've had Selby, we've got Tamworth and the Beds coming up with a whole plethora of by-election with huge swings to Labour Party because people in the country are thirsty for change. And the one word that we kept hearing on the doorsteps was change, 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 change. And we were the only ones offering that. We ran a really positive campaign about making work.
Yeah, see, well, let me pick you up on the change point, because this was a thing that Rishi Sunak was talking about in his conference speech just the other day about how he's going to be the change. I actually thought that was quite a clever device in his conference speech because he's just trying to confuse voters about change and about who's going to be the candidate for change.
If the only thing he can offer is confusion, then we're really in trouble as a country. This is the Prime Minister who's brought most of the problems that he's having to change from in terms of where he was. He lost to Liz Truss, who subsequently lost to a lettuce. I mean, this Prime Minister can offer nothing. He's offering nothing in his conference speech apart from rehashed announcements and culture wars, and the country just isn't ready for that. They don't want it. They want real change in terms of their mortgages, in terms of the economic stability of the country, in terms of investment in our public services, in terms of the big issues of the day, in terms of energy. And they're offering none of that in terms of what this government's trying to do. He's trying to dismiss the last 13 years that they've been in power. And likewise, we've had 16 years of the SNP in power as well. And people have told us on the doorstep that they feel let down. And because they feel let down, tonight they're voting for change.
Sandesh Gulhani, isn't this going to be a problem for your party at the next general election, in that it was never going to be a de facto referendum on independence, because what it ultimately is going to be is a de facto referendum on the Conservative government, regardless of who the Prime Minister is, on the Conservative government?
So in seats up and down Scotland, where we are campaigning very hard, this is not what we're hearing. We're hearing about people's apathy with the SNP. And look, what we heard there about the Prime Minister, if confusion is ensuring that our kids aren't going to be smoking, if confusion is taking £36 billion and powering up the north, if confusion is getting
but that's not going to happen in the next year before a general election, is it?
If that's confusion, then I simply don't really understand, because, you know, transport east to west in our country is appalling. So this is absolutely powering up the
Appalling
North.
after 13 years of Conservative government. The Prime Minister was championing the Manchester Airport link that opened in 2014. He said that would be a future priority. They've already scrapped the Leamside announcement today that said it weren't going to happen. They had an extension of the Nottingham tram line that opened in 2018. They've re-announced policies that actually Rishi Sunak scrapped. Liz Truss brought back, Rishi Sunak scrapped.
There we have
Michael
Michael
Shanks.
Shanks.
That's what they're offering.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there we have Michael Shanks at the count. I mean, he's not looking that happy, is he? I'm not sure he's looking at 14%.
He's smiling.
Yeah.
He is. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean,
Colin, this declaration, when it comes, might take some time because there are 14 candidates, and
which is a record in Scotland, isn't it?
The Scottish by-election, so it might take quite some time. Incidentally, I've just checked. The swing in Hamilton 67 was 37.9 and 33% in Govan and 88. We're getting nowhere near that, despite the fact Ian Murray, with every 5 minutes, is sticking another 1% onto the size.
If it's 1% every 5 minutes, as long as we go till 6 in the morning, I might get somewhere closer.
But I mean, no. I mean, these are the pictures from the count. It looks like the counting is done because there's nobody doing the kind of.
Sorry, they're doing the adjudication.
They're doing the adjudication, so this is where they find out. This is where they go and look at some of the spoiled ballot papers, isn't it?
People have written on their ballot papers.
And some people write the most outrageous things. Some people draw pictures, I gather, on their ballot papers.
Well, look, at general elections, you normally
We're past
have
the watershed. It's 13 minutes past 1 in the morning, so go for it.
Go on then. What's the worst you've seen?
At general elections, you only really have 6 or 7 candidates, so people will write stuff. There's 14 candidates. They can write screeds of stuff down this ballot paper, and the number of votes I've claimed for phallic symbols on ballot papers, you would not believe.
Well, do you know what? There is one I've heard. There is a story I've heard about that, and because the phallic symbol that was there was completely within the little square of the ballot paper,
that would be a valid vote.
And because it was erect, that was a positive vote. It was taken as.
You're embarrassing, Bernard.
I think all candidates get used to working.
You told me it was fair to say this after 1 o'clock.
I would never come out with such a thing when I used to sit in that chair.
The more senior Colin Mackay would never have said such a thing either. What's the worst you've seen in a ballot paper, Sandesh? Because you've not been in quite as many elections as some of them.
It's the worst I've seen in a ballot paper.
No, I think I haven't seen anything particularly bad on a ballot paper. When I was at the count in Glasgow, they were just crosses.
They were just crosses, yeah. I mean, the thing is, it is perfectly legitimate for people to spoil their ballot papers because what they're saying by doing that is that really they can't be bothered with any of you.
But they've taken the time to vote.
But they've
they've
taken the time. They've made the effort to vote. So it's much. You know, they're turning up and voting in whatever way they choose in that respect. Is much more significant than people who just don't bother to turn up, isn't it?
There's always a huge story and an untold one, often, in what the spoiled ballot papers look like, whether they are wee stories
I think
or
we just
wee
told
notes
some of it just now.
Pictures that I wouldn't have described myself.
But we just let the cat out of the bag there.
Certainly they're there, but with 14 candidates, it might be a bit more interesting. You know, we don't know what messages will be put forward to all these people.
Can I ask the three of you, did you see any sign of the other candidates? You know, we've got 14.
No.
Now, we know the four main parties, but was there any sign of any of these people whatsoever? You know, there's some pretty weird and wonderful ones. There's the Emperor of India for a start, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident I would have noticed that person.
I mean, we had clips of them all on the debate programme last week, which I think is probably the only time most people in the constituency will have seen most of these candidates.
Well,
it will be interesting, given there are 14 of them, if we get a really low vote.
Get your anorak on, Bernard. What's the lowest vote anybody's had in Scotland?
The lowest vote, it was the Hillhead by-election in 1982, dubbed the by-election of the century, won by Roy Jenkins of the STP, and Commander Bill Boakes, who was a veteran of many by-elections, who used to stand as a public safety, democratic monarchist, white resident, and that's what was always on the ballot paper, and he got 5 votes in Hillhead. So if any,
which is less than you need to get the nomination to stand,
does he
isn't
not
it?
need 10 folk? So you need 10. So Commander Boakes would have needed 10 people to sign his nomination papers, but only 5 of them presumably voted for him. So anything less than 5, that's a record in the Scottish by-election.
So we're looking for records tonight at both ends of this by-election almost, aren't we?
Yeah. So
Kirsten, what what evidence was there of any of these other parties? Because, you know, if you look at the Greens, for example, you know, you're in coalition government effectively with them in the Scottish Parliament, but they're standing against you here. Are they going to take votes away from the SNP tonight, do you think?
Well, they may do. So, you know, let's see what the numbers tell us. But, you know, I have to say, having been on the ground a lot, I haven't really seen evidence of the other parties. I haven't seen canvassers from any of these parties knocking on doors, and I've not heard about that from others as well. So, you know, we've been around and about the place a huge amount, and it's just not something that's been reported back.
What about wee parties like Reform or Vote? Are they going to take votes from the Conservative, Sandesh?
It's difficult to say.
A family
party? Certainly the people, they will get some votes, but it's hard to say, you know, quite what numbers they're going to get. But you know, this is again what sort of happens in a by-election. You're going to see far more people coming out, and you can see a few votes going to these parties. But that doesn't tend to happen in a big general election.
The best election slogan that I've ever heard, again, Govern 88, there was a chap called Fraser Clark who stood for the Rainbow Alliance Smiley Zippy Party, and his election slogan was govern yourselves.
But, well, going back to that one, the Monster Raving Loony Party stood in that one. Screaming Lord Such, I think, stood in that one, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he's sadly dead now, but, I mean, no sign of them in this list of 14. Whatever happened to the Monster Raving Loony Party, Ian?
They're now back the SNP. Oh, Ian, sorry, I couldn't resist it. I couldn't resist it. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist it.
So anyway, you're talking earlier about this being a turning point, about this being a turning point on the road to a Labour government. What are people turning to you, and what are they turning away from?
Well, they want change, and they seek that change. I mean, they've had a pretty dire time with this Conservative government, and increasingly with the SNP government in the Scottish context. And one of the big changes, I think, in Scottish politics, and Bernard hit the nail on the head earlier, is people are increasingly seeing the issue of the Constitution further and further down their own political priorities. So I think we'll go into the next general election with the top priority of the people being about change, being about the cost of living, being about public services, and it won't factor at all or very much in the whole election campaign. That helps the Labour Party, of course, because Anas Sarwar, since he became leader, has wanted to talk about those bread and butter issues that people are talking about round their dinner tables and in the pubs, and that's what he's stuck to, and staying off the Constitution, because people are worried about how they live their lives and pay their bills, and they don't want to be hearing about constitutional arguments that are so far away from their own lives that they just don't see it as being relevant.
So have you been excluded from the debate in Scotland for the last 10 years because you wouldn't take a position on the Constitution other than going with Better Together in 2014? You've not been willing to give any kind of nuance or change to that position?
Well, because we've been concentrating on the issues that are important to the Scottish people, and you see in this by-election...
To be fair, you've had quite a lot of infighting as well during the Corbyn years,
and that's why I think we're turning the corner tonight. We're doubling our Scottish Parliamentary Party representation. If the projections that we're hearing from the count are indeed correct and Michael becomes a colleague, we'll have a Christmas party for the Scottish Parliamentary Labour Party that has 2 people in it. This year it sets up Keir Starmer...
You booked your phone box already.
It sets up Keir Starmer to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, delivering that majority Labour government, because that makes the majority much easier if you can deliver Scottish seats. And if we are looking at the kind of swings that I've been increasing every 5 minutes on this programme, and we are looking at the kind of seats that transfers to, then it's game on across Scotland for helping and contributing to delivering that to majority Labour government.
Is Keir Starmer the heir of Blair?
Keir Starmer's the next Prime Minister. He's the
But is he the heir
of
of Blair? I mean, he was all bosom buddies with Tony Blair a month or so ago.
Well, look, Keir's happy to take advice from everyone. I mean, Tony Blair, don't forget, is the most successful Labour leader in history, winning 3 general
Harold
elections.
Wilson won 4.
Well, but in recent history,
Harold Wilson
perhaps.
won 4.
In recent history. So it's really important to... You can't take advice of somebody who's dead, though, Bernard. So it's really important to take advice of people. It's really important to mould that
I think
message.
Harold Wilson's advice would be substantially different from the advice that Tony Blair
the important thing is that if you're wanting to promote change in a positive policy platform, you've got to put that to people. Look, Keir Starmer changed the Labour Party. Undeniably, that's now happened. People see a different Labour Party. We're now putting the meat on the bones of that policy agenda going forward. to put that to the people come the next general election and kick this rancid and rotten Tory government out of Downing
Kirsten's
Street.
itching to come in here.
I'm wondering in all this positive talk, you know, where are things like the 2-child cap? You know, why is it that you don't feel able to?
I've answered it directly
and you disagree with your candidate on it, and how is that refusal to engage on that helping people with the cost of living crisis?
Fundamental reform of universal credit is
really
part of
important. You know, will you back us in this? Will you back us and push?
Why don't you do it?
And you'll back us on that.
Why don't you do it?
And you'll back us on that.
Why don't you do it?
So if we take something forward in the House of Commons, we can rely upon Ian's backing. That, I think, is what he's saying.
You have the powers in the Scottish Parliament from the Scotland Act of 2016 to do it. Why are you not
why
doing
is the Scottish Parliament the end point of all of this? We cannot be a Parliament of mitigation.
You don't.
Well, if, as you say, if we do, then we have instituted the Scottish Child Payment.
Use the rules.
So if I can finish, we've brought forward the Scottish Child Payment. That has been something that across the globe, if I can finish, because I haven't interrupted you, that people are seeing as a change maker. So you need to get in behind our programme. I'm disappointed that you won't accept and agree to come on board with the 2-child cap. And what about Brexit as well? This is something that people here and people across Scotland are really interested in. So I would put that back to you. You know, what are you suggesting that, you know, if it's a Labour victory here, we're going to hear and see more on that?
A much closer relationship with the European Union. Keir
But you're not willing.
With Emmanuel Macron in France.
You're not willing.
To repair our tattered international
relationship. It's quite amazing to hear the SNP talking down the Scottish Parliament, and it must be the case. It must be the case because of the embarrassment of Humza Yousaf as First Minister.
But tell us how they're talking it down.
How talking it down? Talking it down by saying that that's not the place where you are in government to be able to bring in your policies.
All the viewers have heard that that's absolutely not what I said.
Where you have a majority to bring in the things that you want to bring in because of your coalition with the Green Party. And also, when you talk about Labour, we're talking about a flip-flopping Keir Starmer, who we're not sure what he stands for.
You've fundamentally wrecked the economy. You're costing every single family in this constituency and across the country thousands of pounds a year because you backed a Prime Minister that crashed the economy.
I did not.
You've got utterly no credibility whatsoever when it comes to economic matters in this country. And quite frankly, the speech in your conference this week was a complete and utter embarrassment. Keir Starmer wants to repair a tattered international relationship, get closer ties with the European Union, all in the national interest.
By flip-flopping every time.
Let me just ask you this then, because we're still waiting on the result coming from the by-election, which, just as a reminder, is why we're all here tonight. We're waiting for the result from the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. The count's going on, Ewan's there. We'll get the result as soon as we can, hopefully in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so.
You said that at 1 o'clock.
I did say that at 1 o'clock, and I'm still hopeful that we'll get it in the next 15 to 20 minutes. But one thing that we just don't know is we've had a by-election here today. We've got another by-election coming up in Mid-Beds later this month. Nadine Dorries has stood down eventually. That's going to be a tough fight between you two probably at the moment. Don't know where the Lib Dems are going to fit into that. But a crucial key question at the moment is, when are we going to get a general election? That's what everybody really wants to know. Bernard, when are we going to get a general election?
I have no idea, but I'm pretty certain that the general election will be fought on the cost of living crisis. I have no doubt that the reason why Rishi Sunak was trying to get the political agenda onto different issues in his conference speech is that he knows that it's an uncomfortable agenda for the Conservatives. At the general election, whenever it comes, I think inflation will be closer to 2% than 5%, so he can say that they're on the road to dealing with inflation. The problem is, though, that higher rents, higher mortgage repayments, and the Governor of the Bank of England has made it absolutely abundantly clear that mortgage rates are going to stay relatively high for a longer period of time, that the component parts of the cost of living crisis will still be a reality whenever that election comes, if it goes early in June.
And prices in shops won't necessarily have come down, they'll just not be going up as much.
They won't go up as much. So that cost of living crisis, there will be anger. Which party can address it properly? And this is why I think that it's such an overarching issue, that the challenge for the SNP, in a sense, is how they link those issues to the issue of constitutional change. Because after the result of this by-election, there will be people within the broader independence movement who will simply be saying, how did it come to this? And how is it a year from a general election, the Scottish Government are still not unambiguously clear about the route to independence.
Sandesh Gohani, when do you think the Prime Minister should be going to the polls for the next general election?
Well, I'll confidently tell you it'll be next year.
Right. So you don't think he's going to go to the wire then? You don't think he's going to go to January 2025, which he could?
He could. I don't think. I think it'll be next year.
When would you like to see him go to the polls next year then? What's your preference? Do you go for the spring option? Do you go for a summer option in June, for example? Or do you go for the winter option or the autumn option, October, maybe even November?
I mean, you've basically said every month there.
Well, I'm asking, because I'm asking you which one you think he should go for. What would your advice be to Rishi Sunak today? He might be watching.
My advice for Rishi Sunak...
Be watching on the STV player, for all we know.
It'd be very clear. Keep doing what you're doing, Prime Minister, because you're doing a good job.
But what's your advice to him on when he should be going to the country?
We don't know.
No, but what's your advice to him?
Genuinely, I don't know.
What's your opinion?